Tell me the truth, Hyunjin. Felix's voice cracked through the empty hallway like shattered glass, his trembling hand gripping a crumpled photograph. How long were you planning to lie to me? The fluorescent lights above flickered weakly, casting uneven shadows across the practice room door. Outside, rain hammered against the building's windows, turning the city beyond into a blur of silver and black. Hyunjin stood frozen. For a moment, neither of them moved. Felix's chest rose and fell violently. Months of anger, confusion, and heartbreak burned inside him like a fire he could no longer control. Every sleepless night, every painful memory, every unanswered question had led him to this moment, and Hyunjin was standing directly in front of him. I trusted you, Felix whispered. The words hurt more than shouting ever could. Hyunjin lowered his gaze. His fingers tightened around the strap of his bag. You think I wanted this? He asked quietly. Felix laughed bitterly. Wanted what? To destroy everything. The rain grew louder. Hyunjin's jaw clenched. You don't know the whole story. Then tell me. The silence that followed felt endless. Felix had spent nearly a year believing Hyunjin was responsible for the worst day of his life. A year earlier, Felix had received a message that changed everything, an anonymous email. No name, no explanation, just evidence that someone close to him had betrayed his trust. The message arrived on a night when he was already emotionally exhausted. He remembered sitting alone in his apartment, staring at his laptop screen while the city lights flickered outside. Attached to the email were photographs, private conversations, fragments of information that should never have existed. And every clue pointed toward one person, Hyunjin. From that moment, something inside Felix began to break. He never confronted Hyunjin directly. Instead, he watched, observed, collected details, every delayed response, every strange expression. Every suspicious coincidence. The more he looked, the guiltier Hyunjin seemed. At least that was what Felix convinced himself. The belief became a habit. The habit became certainty. And certainty became resentment. Months passed. Their conversations grew shorter. Their smiles became forced. The friendship that once felt unbreakable slowly transformed into a fragile performance. Nobody understood why. Not even their closest friends. Only Felix knew the reason, or at least he thought he did. Now standing in the dim hallway, he finally wanted answers. Hyunjin took a slow breath. Do you remember the showcase in Busan? He asked. Felix frowned. What does that have to do with anything? Everything. The memory surfaced immediately. The showcase had happened nearly 18 months ago, a massive event, thousands of fans, countless reporters. It was also the first time Felix noticed someone following them. At the time, he dismissed it, a coincidence, nothing more. But Hyunjin apparently remembered. I saw him again, Hyunjin said. Felix blinked. What? The man who kept watching us? Hallway suddenly felt colder, rainwater rattled against the glass. Hyunjin looked exhausted, as if he had carried a burden for far too long. I started investigating after Busan. Stared. You investigated? Hyunjin nodded. I didn't tell anyone because I wasn't sure. About what? Hyunjin hesitated, then he finally looked directly into Felix's eyes. Someone was trying to get close to us. A chill crawled down Felix's spine. The certainty he had held for so long began to shift, only slightly, but enough to make him uncomfortable. Felix said immediately, You don't believe me? This sounds ridiculous. Does it? Hyunjin reached into his bag. Felix instinctively stepped back, but instead of pulling out something threatening, Hyunjin removed a thick folder, worn edges, hundreds of pages, documents, photographs, printed emails. Felix's heartbeat accelerated. What is that? Hyunjin swallowed. Proof. Folder landed heavily between them. The sound echoed through the hallway. For the first time, Felix saw genuine pain in Hyunjin's expression. Not guilt, not fear, pain, the kind that came from being misunderstood for too long. You spent a year hatting me, Hyunjin said softly. Felix couldn't answer, because part of him already knew something was wrong. Part of him feared opening that folder, feared discovering that his anger had been misplaced. Feared learning that the villain he had created existed only inside his own mind. With shaking hands, Felix opened the first page. His eyes scanned the documents, then the second page, then the third. The color slowly drained from his face. Names, dates, locations, surveillance photographs, records, everything connected. Everything pointed somewhere else, someone else, not Hyunjin, never Hyunjin. Felix felt the ground beneath him disappear. The hallway blurred. His breathing became uneven. Every accusation, every cold shoulder, every moment of bitterness, every cruel assumption, wrong, completely wrong. Hyunjin watched silently. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, no victory, only sadness. Felix looked up. Long, his voice trembled. How long have you known? Hyunjin gave a weak smile. Long enough. Answer shattered something inside Felix, because suddenly he remembered every time Hyunjin had tried to talk, every unfinished conversation, every concerned glance, every moment he had pushed him away. The memories arrived all at once. Relentless, painful. Felix closed the folder, his hands were shaking. I blamed you. The words barely escaped his lips. Hyunjin nodded. I know, I hated you. Nod, I know. Rain outside gradually softened. The storm that had dominated the night began fading into silence. Felix lowered his head. For the first time in months, the anger was gone. In its place remained something much heavier, regret. The realization hurt more than betrayal ever could. Because betrayal by an enemy was painful, but hurting someone who cared about you was devastating. Neither of them spoke for a while. The hallway remained quiet except for distant thunder. Then Hyunjin stepped forward, not with anger, not with resentment, just understanding. I never stopped being your friend, he said. Felix felt tears sting the corners of his eyes. The simple sentence carried more weight than any accusation. Because despite everything, despite the blame, the distance, and the misunderstandings, Hyunjin had stayed, not because he had to, but because he cared. Felix finally looked up. And for the first time in a year he saw the truth clearly. The person he had spent months blaming had actually been trying to protect him all along. The real enemy had never stood in front of him. The real enemy was the lie he had believed. And now that the truth had finally surfaced, all that remained was the difficult journey of rebuilding the trust that had once seemed impossible to break. Outside, the rain stopped completely. A pale light emerged between the clouds. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of them walked away. The next morning arrived quietly. Sunlight filtered through the large studio windows, painting long golden lines across the polished floor. The city seemed strangely peaceful after the storm, but Felix's mind was anything but calm. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, memories returned, the folder, the documents, the evidence, the realization that he had spent an entire year blaming the wrong person. Felix sat alone in the practice room, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The room smelled faintly of wood and dust from yesterday's rehearsal. Somewhere outside, distant traffic hummed through the city. Normally this place felt familiar, comforting. Today it felt like a courtroom, and he was the one on trial. His own reflection seemed like a stranger, a person capable of making terrible mistakes, a person who had allowed suspicion to become certainty. The door opened behind him. Felix didn't need to turn around. He recognized the footsteps immediately. Hyunjin. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. The silence felt different now, less hostile, more uncertain. Hyunjin walked inside carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside Felix. I wasn't sure if you'd be here. Felix stared at the cup. You still bought one for me? Hyunjin shrugged. I always did. Simple answer hit harder than expected. Felix lowered his eyes. Of course he had, even during the months they barely spoke, even when Felix ignored him. Even when everything between them felt broken, Hyunjin had continued showing up, not dramatically, not loudly, just consistently. The realization made Felix's chest ache. I'm sorry. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Hyunjin sat beside him, neither looked at the other. For a while they simply stared at the mirror, 2 reflections, 2 people carrying different wounds from the same story. I know, Hyunjin finally said. Felix swallowed. No, you don't understand. His voice grew quieter. I don't think I even understand. Confession hung heavily between them because regret wasn't simple. It wasn't something that disappeared after one apology. Regret lingered. It replayed moments you wished you could erase. It forced you to see yourself honestly, and honesty could be brutal. Felix rubbed his hands together. I kept finding reasons to believe you were guilty. Hyunjin remained silent. Every time something felt suspicious, I used it as proof. The words came slowly, painfully. Even when the evidence wasn't there. A bitter laugh escaped him. I think I wanted someone to blame. The first time Hyunjin looked at him, not with judgment, just understanding, because blaming someone is easier than living with uncertainty. Felix nodded. Exactly. The anonymous messages, the betrayal, the confusion, the fear, it had all felt unbearable, so his mind created an answer, an explanation, and once he believed it, he stopped questioning it. The room fell quiet again. Outside, sunlight reflected off nearby buildings. Life continued as if nothing had happened, yet everything felt different. Hyunjin leaned back against the wall. Person who sent those messages wanted that. Felix looked over. Wanted what? You to suspect someone close to you. Felix's expression darkened. The thought had haunted him all night. If Hyunjin wasn't responsible, then who was and why? The folder contained clues, evidence, fragments of a larger puzzle, but not the final answer. The truth remained incomplete. Did you ever find them? Felix asked. Hyunjin's silence answered first, then came a slow shake of the head. No. The single word chilled the room. Felix stared. What do you mean no? I mean exactly that. Hyunjin's gaze drifted toward the window. Evidence points somewhere. Not to a specific person. Not in Felix's stomach tightened. For months he believed the mystery was solved, now he realized it had never been solved at all. The real culprit remained hidden. Watching, waiting, somewhere, the thought made his skin crawl. Hyunjin opened his bag. He pulled out a small notebook, worn old, its pages were filled with handwritten notes. Felix immediately recognized the careful writing, Hyunjin's. "I kept records." Felix accepted the notebook. The pages contained observations spanning nearly 18 months, dates, locations, strange encounters, unknown phone numbers, witness descriptions. Felix's eyes widened. "You did all of this alone?" Hyunjin smiled weakly. "Exactly." Felix looked up. "What does that mean?" Before Hyunjin could answer, the practice room door suddenly opened, both turned. A familiar face stepped inside, Changbin. He froze immediately after noticing them. His eyes moved from Felix to Hyunjin, then back again. The tension in the room was impossible to miss. For a moment nobody spoke, then Changbin sighed heavily. Finally, Felix blinked. "What?" Changbin shook his head. "You two are impossible." Hyunjin laughed quietly. The first genuine laugh Felix had heard from him in months. It sounded strange, almost unfamiliar. Changbin crossed his arms. "You know how exhausting it was pretending everything was normal." Felix looked away. Guilt returned immediately. Changbin had witnessed the distance, the arguments, the coldness. Everyone had, nobody understood why, yet they all suffered because of it. "We thought you'd eventually talk," Changbin continued. "Instead, you both got worse." Hyunjin smiled apologetically. Felix couldn't even manage that. He simply felt ashamed. Changbin's expression softened, then he looked at Felix. "At least you know now." Felix nodded slowly. "Yeah." Answer barely emerged, because knowing the truth wasn't the end, it was only the beginning of rebuilding trust, repairing damage, facing consequences, and perhaps most importantly, finding the person responsible, the one who had started everything. The one who had manipulated the situation from the shadows. Changbin glanced at the notebook, then at Hyunjin. "Did you tell him?" Hyunjin's face immediately changed, the small smile disappeared. Felix noticed, his heartbeat quickened. "What didn't you tell me?" Changbin frowned. He looked between them, realizing something instantly. "Oh." Room became silent. Hyunjin lowered his gaze. For the first time since last night, genuine hesitation appeared in his eyes. Felix stood. "What is it?" Neither answered immediately. The hesitation itself was terrifying, because some truths are dangerous not because they're shocking, but because they change everything. Finally, Hyunjin exhaled. "There was another reason I investigated." Felix felt his pulse pounding. "What reason?" Hyunjin looked directly at him, and for the first time fear appeared in his expression, not fear for himself, fear for Felix. "Because I think the anonymous messages weren't actually meant for you." Room froze. Felix stared. The words didn't make sense, not at first, then slowly, horribly, a possibility emerged. If the messages weren't meant for him, then someone else had been the real target all along. And suddenly the entire mystery became far more dangerous than either of them had imagined.
The words refused to leave Felix's mind. "I think the anonymous messages weren't actually meant for you." Practice room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. For several seconds, nobody moved. Felix stared at Hyunjin, trying to understand what he had just heard. "What are you talking about?" Hyunjin looked down at the notebook in his hands. The hesitation in his expression worried Felix more than the statement itself, because Hyunjin wasn't someone who scared easily, not anymore. Not after everything he had spent months investigating. "If the messages weren't meant for me," Felix said carefully, "then who were they meant for?" A shadow crossed Hyunjin's face. Changbin quietly closed the door behind him. The click echoed through the room. For some reason, that sound made Felix's heartbeat speed up. Hyunjin finally answered. "Me." Silence, complete silence. Felix blinked, then blinked again. Surely he had heard wrong. "What?" "The messages." Hyunjin swallowed. "I think they were supposed to reach me." Felix felt as if the floor had shifted beneath him. Nothing about this made sense. "How?" Hyunjin sat down slowly. His eyes remained fixed on the notebook, as if the pages contained memories he wished he could forget. "Because before you received the email," his voice became quieter, "I received one too." Room instantly froze. Felix stared. A cold sensation crept down his spine. "You never told me." Hyunjin laughed bitterly. "No." "Why?" The answer came immediately. "Because I deleted it." Felix's eyes widened. "What?" "I thought it was a prank." Confession hung in the air. Hyunjin rubbed his forehead. For the first time, he looked exhausted, truly exhausted, not physically, emotionally, like someone carrying guilt that had never disappeared. "It arrived 3 weeks before yours." Felix couldn't believe what he was hearing. 3 weeks, 3 entire weeks. "You never mentioned it." Hyunjin shook his head. It seemed ridiculous. Notebook trembled slightly in his hands. The email contained photographs. Felix felt his stomach tight. the same photographs, the same manipulated evidence, the same lies. I ignored it. Hyunjin looked away. I thought whoever sent it would give up. Nobody spoke. Outside the window, clouds drifted slowly across the bright afternoon sky. The city looked peaceful, normal, completely unaware of the storm unfolding inside the room. Changbin sat quietly nearby, listening, watching. He already knew this story. Felix did not, and each revelation felt heavier than the last. "What happened after that?" Felix asked. Hyunjin remained silent for a moment, then he answered. The messages continued. Felix felt another chill. They kept coming. His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm people develop after repeating painful memories too many times. Every few weeks, he stared at the floor. Different email addresses, different photographs, different accusations. Felix felt sick because suddenly something became obvious. The messages were never random, they were systematic. Deliberate, someone had spent months carefully planting suspicion, creating confusion, destroying trust, and when Hyunjin refused to react, they changed targets. Felix. The realization was horrifying. Whoever had done this wasn't acting impulsively. They were patient, calculated, dangerous. Felix lowered himself into a chair. His hands felt cold. "You think they switched to me because you ignored them?" Hyunjin nodded. "That's my theory." Room became quiet again. Felix replayed the past year in his mind. Every misunderstanding, every accusation, every painful conversation, all of it traced back to a single decision. Someone choosing to send an email. A simple act. Yet its consequences had nearly destroyed everything. Felix suddenly understood why Hyunjin looked so tired, because he had spent months watching the damage happen, unable to stop it, unable to explain it, unable to prove the truth, and perhaps worst of all, knowing he might have prevented it if he had spoken sooner. Hyunjin looked up. "I should have told you." The words came softly, almost like a confession. Felix shook his head immediately. "No," Hyunjin frowned. "No," Felix exhaled slowly. "You didn't know what would happen. Neither of them did. That was the tragedy. People often imagine disasters beginning with dramatic moments, explosions, arguments, betrayals. But sometimes disasters begin with silence. One deleted email, one conversation never had, one misunderstanding left unchallenged. And before anyone realizes it, everything changes. The afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the floor. Minutes passed. Nobody seemed eager to move. Then Changbin suddenly stood. His expression had changed, serious, focused, almost troubled. "What?" Felix asked. Changbin looked toward Hyunjin, then toward the notebook. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't want to bring this up," neither answered. "But I think you need to know." Room immediately grew tense. Hyunjin's eyes narrowed. Felix felt his pulse quicken. "What is it?" Changbin hesitated. The hesitation alone was enough to create fear. Then he reached into his pocket and removed his phone. "I got something yesterday." Felix frowned. "A message." Changbin nodded. His face had gone pale. The reaction alarmed both of them instantly. Slowly, Changbin unlocked the screen, opened a photo, then handed the phone to Felix. The moment Felix looked at it, his blood ran cold. It was another photograph, a recent one, taken from far away, taken secretly. The image showed 3 people leaving a building late at night. Felix, Hyunjin, and Changbin. None of them appeared aware they were being watched. A date was stamped in the corner. 3 days ago, beneath the image was a single sentence, a sentence that made Felix's stomach drop. Finally getting close to the truth. Room became deathly silent. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The realization settled slowly. Heavy, terrifying. The anonymous sender hadn't disappeared. They hadn't stopped. They were still watching, still following. Still waiting, and somehow, they already knew Felix and Hyunjin had started putting the pieces together. For the first time since opening the folder the previous night, Felix felt genuine fear. Not fear of betrayal, not fear of misunderstanding. Something much worse. The fear of realizing that somewhere beyond those walls, someone knew exactly where they were. And that person had been watching all along. Nobody spoke. The photograph remained on the phone screen, illuminated by the afternoon sunlight pouring through the practice room windows. Felix stared at it. The image looked ordinary at first glance. 3 friends leaving a building. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Yet the longer he looked, the more unsettling it became. Because none of them had known the photo existed. Someone had been there, watching, waiting, recording. A stranger standing somewhere in the darkness while they laughed, talked, and walked home completely unaware. Felix handed the phone back to Changbin. His hands felt numb. "When did you receive it?" "This morning." Changbin's voice was barely above a whisper. Felix looked at Hyunjin. Hyunjin's expression had hardened. The sadness from earlier was gone. Now there was something else. Focus. The same focus Felix remembered from years ago whenever Hyunjin became determined to solve a problem. "This isn't random anymore," Hyunjin said. Nobody disagreed. Because it wasn't. A random prank wouldn't last this long. A random prank wouldn't involve surveillance photographs. A random prank wouldn't continue for nearly 2 years. Whoever was behind this had a purpose. The question was why. Felix sat back down, his thoughts raced. Every possibility seemed worse than the previous one. What if they're dangerous? The question escaped before he could stop it. Silence followed, because none of them had an answer. The uncertainty felt suffocating. Hyunjin leaned forward. "There might be something we've missed." Felix looked up. "What do you mean?" "The pattern." Hyunjin pointed toward the notebook. "People leave patterns." Changbin nodded slowly. Even Felix understood the logic. No matter how careful someone tried to be, habits eventually revealed themselves. The challenge was finding them. For the next hour, the three of them sat together. The notebook remained open between them, pages covered in dates, times, locations, photographs, notes, observations. The investigation Hyunjin had built over 18 months. Felix felt increasingly guilty as he read through it, while he had spent a year blaming Hyunjin. Hyunjin had spent the same year searching for answers, alone, without support. Without trust, yet somehow he never gave up. The realization hurt. Hyunjin turned another page, then another. Suddenly his hand stopped, his eyes narrowed. Changbin noticed immediately. "What is it?" Hyunjin didn't answer. He was staring at a page near the middle of the notebook. Felix leaned closer. "What did you find?" Slowly, Hyunjin pointed toward a series of dates, a long list spread across several months. Felix frowned. At first they looked meaningless. Then he noticed something. Every date matched a specific event, a rehearsal, a meeting, a recording session, public schedules, official activities. His heartbeat quickened. "Wait," Hyunjin nodded. "You see it too." Felix looked again. The realization formed slowly, terribly. The anonymous messages always arrived after official schedules, never before, never during, always after. As if someone was observing them in person, watching events unfold, then selecting information afterward. Changbin's face darkened. Someone close. Words hung heavily in the room. Nobody wanted to say them. But everyone understood. The possibility had become impossible to ignore. The sender might not be a stranger. The sender might not be hiding far away. The sender might be someone within their circle, someone familiar, someone trusted. A cold chill spread through Felix's chest. The thought was almost unbearable, because betrayal from an unknown person was frightening. Betrayal from someone familiar was devastating. Hyunjin slowly closed the notebook. "We need proof." Felix nodded immediately. Without proof, suspicion was meaningless. He knew that better than anyone. After all, suspicion had nearly destroyed his friendship with Hyunjin. He refused to repeat the same mistake. The sun had begun setting outside. Orange light painted the skyline. Long shadows stretched across the practice room floor. For the first time all day, exhaustion began catching up to them. Changbin rubbed his eyes. Felix felt a headache building. Even Hyunjin looked tired. Yet nobody wanted to leave. The photograph remained fresh in their minds. The knowledge that someone was watching made every moment feel different. Every hallway, every window, every passing stranger. Potentially important. Potentially dangerous. Eventually, they packed their things. The city outside was transitioning into evening. Neon signs flickered to life. Cars filled the streets below. The ordinary sounds of life continued. Yet Felix couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. As they exited the building together, he found himself looking over his shoulder repeatedly, searching faces, scanning crowds, looking for someone who might be watching. The behavior felt paranoid, yet understandable, because now he knew the threat was real. They walked toward the parking area in silence. The air smelled faintly of rain from the previous night. Streetlights illuminated the pavement. For a few moments, everything seemed normal. Then Hyunjin suddenly stopped walking, instantly, without warning. Felix nearly collided with him. What happened? Hyunjin didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed across the street. Changbin followed his gaze, then froze. Felix turned. At first he saw nothing unusual, just pedestrians, traffic, lights. Then he noticed a figure standing beneath a street lamp, far away, too far to identify clearly. The person wore a dark hooded jacket, motionless. Watching, Felix's pulse exploded. The figure didn't move, didn't look away, didn't react, just stood there. The distance made it impossible to see their face. Yet somehow Felix knew, instinctively. The person was looking directly at them. Several seconds passed. Nobody moved. The city noise faded into the background. All Felix could hear was his own heartbeat. Then the figure did something unexpected, slowly, Deliberately, they raised one hand and waved, not a friendly wave, not a greeting, something colder, something that felt intentional, like a message, like confirmation. I see you. The gesture lasted only a moment. Then a bus passed between them, large, bright, blocking the view entirely. When it moved away seconds later, the figure was gone, vanished, as if they had never existed. The sidewalk stood empty beneath the street lamp. No footsteps, no movement, no trace, only silence. Felix felt ice run through his veins. Changbin looked shaken. Even Hyunjin appeared stunned. For nearly 2 years, the sender had remained hidden, a ghost, an unseen presence. But tonight, for the first time, the ghost had looked back.
The image of the hooded figure haunted Felix for days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that silent wave beneath the street lamp. Not threatening, not aggressive, somehow worse, confident, as if the person already knew something they didn't, as if the game had never been equal. The following week passed in a blur of tension and unanswered questions. Felix, Hyunjin, and Changbin continued examining every clue they possessed, every photograph, every email, every date, every coincidence. What had once looked like random fragments slowly began forming a complete picture, and when the truth finally emerged, it was nothing like any of them expected. It happened on a quiet evening. The three of them sat inside a small conference room, surrounded by stacks of documents and notebooks. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The atmosphere felt strangely calm, almost peaceful. Hyunjin was reviewing a list of timestamps when his eyes suddenly widened. He froze. Felix immediately noticed. "What is it?" Hyunjin didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned several pages, compared multiple documents, then looked up. His face had gone pale. "I found it." Room became silent. Changbin leaned forward. "Found what?" Hyunjin swallowed. "The mistake." Felix felt his pulse quicken. Every person eventually makes mistakes, even careful ones, especially careful ones, because after years of success, people begin believing they're invisible, untouchable. And that's when they become careless. Hyunjin spread several photographs across the table. Most appeared ordinary: crowds, buildings, events, schedules, but one detail repeated throughout them all, a reflection, tiny, almost impossible to notice. A person standing in the background, the same person again and again and again, always distant, always partially hidden, yet undeniably present. Felix stared. His heartbeat accelerated. For nearly 2 years, the sender had been documenting their lives. Yet unknowingly, they had captured themselves in the process. The realization was almost unbelievable. Changbin looked speechless. Hyunjin slowly exhaled. "We weren't being followed by a stranger." The words landed heavily. Felix already knew, deep down, before Hyunjin even said the next sentence. The sender was someone they knew, someone who had always been nearby, someone who blended naturally into their world, someone nobody ever suspected. When the final pieces came together, the answer was devastating, not because the person was evil, not because they hated them, but because the entire tragedy had begun from something far more human. Jealousy, misunderstanding, obsession. The sender had spent years feeling invisible, overlooked, ignored, watching friendships they wished they had, watching connections they couldn't create themselves. At first they only observed, then curiosity became fixation. Fixation became resentment. And resentment eventually became manipulation. The anonymous messages were never designed to destroy lives. At least not initially. They were meant to create cracks, tiny fractures, moments of doubt. But people rarely understand the consequences of their actions until those consequences grow beyond their control. By the time the sender realized the damage they had caused, everything had spiraled far beyond what they intended. Friendships had broken, trust had disappeared, pain had spread. And fear had replaced certainty. When confronted with the evidence, the person finally confessed, not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly, like someone exhausted from carrying a secret too long. The confession lasted hours, tears were shed, questions were answered, apologies were offered, yet none of it erased the past. Some wounds heal, others simply become part of who we are. The sender accepted responsibility, and eventually stepped away from their lives completely, not because they were forced to. Because they understood that healing sometimes requires distance. Months passed. Life slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. The fear disappeared first, then the tension, then the constant suspicion. The world felt lighter, brighter, safer. For Felix, however, the greatest challenge wasn't forgiving the sender. It was forgiving himself, because long after the mystery ended, he continued remembering the year he spent blaming Hyunjin. The cold conversations, the accusations, the distance. The hurt, those memories remained. One evening, nearly a year after everything ended, Felix and Hyunjin found themselves sitting together on a rooftop overlooking the city. The sky glowed with thousands of lights. A warm breeze drifted through the night air. For a while neither spoke. They simply watched the city breathe beneath them. Finally, Felix broke the silence. "Do you ever wish none of it happened?" Hyunjin smiled thoughtfully. The question lingered between them, then he answered. "Sometimes." Felix nodded. The response felt honest, real. Hyunjin looked toward the horizon. If it hadn't happened, he paused, we wouldn't understand each other the way we do now. Felix considered that perhaps pain always leaves something behind, not always damage, sometimes wisdom, sometimes perspective, sometimes gratitude. The city lights reflected in Hyunjin's eyes. For the first time in a long time, Felix felt completely at peace. No secrets, no suspicion, no fear, just truth, simple and clear. The thing he had searched for all along. Felix smiled quietly. I should have trusted you. Hyunjin laughed, and I should have told you sooner. They looked at each other, then both laughed, not because the past was funny, but because it was finally over. The burden had disappeared, the misunderstanding had ended, the truth had won. As the night deepened around them, the city shimmered below like a sea of stars, and Felix realized something important. The greatest damage had never come from the anonymous messages, or the photographs, or the lies. The greatest damage came from allowing fear to speak louder than trust. And the greatest healing came from finding the courage to face the truth, even when it hurt. Side by side under the endless night sky, Felix and Hyunjin watched the lights of the city glow in the distance, not as two people divided by suspicion, but as two friends who had survived it. And this time neither of them looked away.